We're really pleased you can join us for what's going to be an insightful discussion. We're going to dive into AI strategy and implementation and explore the pitfalls of charging ahead too quickly. A few quick housekeeping points before we get going. The webinar will run for 30 minutes. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box as we go. And this session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or you want to revisit the discussion, you'll be able to access it later. So unfortunately, we do not have Mel Hodge with us this morning, but I'm joined today by a fantastic speaker who brings with them a wealth of expertise in AI and data strategy. So continuing from our first webinar, we have Ben Howarth, Head of Practice for AI, who'll be kicking things off, looking at the problems you might encounter when implementing AI in your organization. So let's get started. I guess the big question here, Ben, is your AI model delivering the right outcome? So over to you to kick us off, please.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. I suppose really quickly, just a minute just to recap what we discussed in the first webinar, because we're going to lean on that quite heavily as we go through today's session. So the first webinar was all about setting those foundations. If we use the car analogy with our bumps in the road and everything else, it's about getting your driving license. So finding out what we need, making sure we have everything in place and getting the teams together to actually deliver our AI application, whether that be an internal or an external facing application. Today, we're going to make the assumption that we've got to the point and we've put that application live. And now we're going to start looking about, okay, so how do we stop falling into some of the unfortunate bumps in the road? Some of them may actually seem obvious, and we can maybe mitigate those pre-hand, and some of them are items which just come up and they're part of everyday business life. So the first one is, how do we know that our AI model is delivering the correct response? So when we conceived the idea, we had a single notion as to why we actually wanted to create the model in the first place. So we wanted to answer a business question. We went from that business question through our business teams and we built a set of requirements. And with those requirements, we then transferred that to our technical teams and everyone got on board with the process. We were 100% confident. Everyone was aware of what it was we were trying to deliver. As part of that, we start to build our training data set, which is data that we're going to use to train our model to give the responses we're expecting to the questions we're going to be asked. And along the way, we also build up that list of questions and our expected answers. And that's kind of our testing bed, if you like. So I ask it a question, I receive a response, and is that in the response range that I'm expecting? And if the answer to that is yes, then we go forward and we put the model live. Now that we're live, we're starting to see incorrect responses. Now, there could be a multitude of reasons for that. It could just simply be that the test questions that we came up with were too narrow and people are asking different questions in different ways or the same question in a slightly different way and therefore getting a slightly different response to what we expected. Now, how can we tell if that's actually happening? Complaints usually are something that businesses shy away from, but in this case, it's actually one of our best friends. So customers will always like to tell us what we're doing wrong at the wrong times, and we can use that to our advantage. We can actually take those complaints and we can find out what's going on. We will actually find out what the customer asked and the response, if they've been honest with us, that they received. And if that's not what we expected that customer to get, then we have an issue, and we have an issue which we can address by looking back at the training data and retesting our training data to see whether or not those questions and answers are in there. The other part that we might also find is that we just need to expand it. We need to expand that training data. We might need to now add more training data and retrain the model. So these are kind of things that we will find when we put something into the real world. The difference between doing it with an AI and doing it with a call center script, as an example, is the fact that as a human, I'm able to adjust. And that's the key part here. As an AI model, I'm going to respond in the way that I was trained to do so. So it's a very prescribed process when we start using AI. In the kind of call center world where we actually have the humans answering the telephone and having a human-to-human conversation, we're able to adjust, and AI we're not. And it's a very clear definition. So the next question we need to ask ourselves is, actually, did we actually build the model for the right reasons, or are we using it for its original purpose? So it might be a question that we came up with a business reason for having an AI model. That AI model may be just to be a front line of for the call center, so some very basic questions that we expect to get from our customers, and be able to answer them in a really quick and efficient manner, which takes some of the weight off our call center and allows our teams to investigate and help our customers who truly do need that help. And in the same way, for the customers calling in, they're able to get the answer they want in a really quick fashion, and that actually should improve our trust and scores with those customers. But actually, have we tried to take it one step too far? Have we said that we also want to try and see if we can answer this process? Our model was really good at dealing with these customer calls, so can we expand it slightly? Can we use this model to also answer this set of questions? And the answer is yes, you could, but you have to go all the way back to the start, and we had to rebuild that training data to now include that second data set, those second questions and answers we're expecting to give our customers. If we haven't taken that step, then we're not going to be sure when the question comes into the AI model if it's going to give the response that we're expecting our customers to receive. So there's a question of, actually, should we start building models for every type of scenario? And the answer to that is probably no. If those scenarios are close enough, we can update our training data to reflect that. If the scenarios are different, then yes, we should be using different models to answer different questions. There is a cost implication with that, and obviously that's why some people potentially try to be greedy and try to use the same model for multiple purposes. So that brings me on to the last point on this slide. How do we stop ourselves from doing that? So when we talked in the first webinar about how we go about identifying the need for a model, and we start bringing that model to life by recording all of those business requirements and making sure that our business teams and our technical teams are talking to each other, we also talked about bringing in an important set of people, which are our governance and compliance teams. They need to be fully aware of what it is we're trying to do and why. And they work with those business and those technical teams to make sure there's a governance framework in place. And when we use the word governance, it always sounds like it's quite an authoritarian transaction. And in this case, it's not. It's a group of people who work with the teams, and they're constantly just asking those questions. Are you building this, and does it still fit with the original requirements? Are we in compliance? Are we using data that we can publicly share? Yeah, especially if this is an AI, say, chatbot that's talking to customers directly. Is there information in there that we are able to share? So has GDPR rules been put in place? They make sure that we do have that complaints process. Again, complaints usually is something that a lot of people shy away from, and in respects to AI, they're a really quick indicator if we've got a problem, something we can do. And they govern around that technical piece as well. So with the onboarding of AI into the world, there are new frameworks. So the UK has a framework, the EU have regulations. Other countries are following suit with both frameworks and regulations. And we do need to make sure that we're compliant with those. So are we going through a .com website? And if we are, then we're open to the whole world. And we need to make sure that we're in compliance with anybody that may well come to a .com. And they're important to make sure they satisfy that. The other piece, which as we go through today's webinar, we'll also just touch on, those governance teams will also make sure that we can build against the 5 pillars. So again, just from the first one, fairness, contestability, transparency, accountability, and safety. Safety is an obvious one. It's ensuring that both ourselves as a business and our clients, our customers, are always safe. So again, we can fall back to GDPR in the UK, making sure that we don't give away customer data. Transparency and accountability. So when we go back to those complaints and we try to answer them, we need to be able to explain them in a transparent way. So why did that customer receive the answer that they did? And accountability. So that's not to say that somebody's going to have the finger pointed at them, but we need to make sure that as a business we're accountable for our answers, and we're able to resolve them. So resolve usually through contestability. So if we need to change something, we need to take a piece of data out from our training data. We need to make sure that our model is compliant. And fairness. So we need to make sure that we always treat our customers fairly. And that may be the fact that AI sometimes is not the right way. So how do we make it possible for a client or a customer, when they're talking to that model, to get to an advisor to talk to a human? Oh,
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Ben. Folks, a reminder that if you've got any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A box and we'll tackle them at the end. So next up, we're going to take a step further into where issues might arise and how you can help mitigate these before getting started. So Ben, back to you, please.
Yeah, and thanks, Paul. Again, we go back to our training data. So making sure our training data is as wide and as varied as possible. There's a piece in there to say that our training data should not be past the point of the requirements we're trying to answer, and that's 100% true. But we do need to make sure that we have trained our model and we are able to question it and receive answers and responses that we want from a wide standpoint to answer that original brief. We can't make them too narrow, because the answer they give will not necessarily be reflective of what the customer is looking for. But we don't want to extend past our requirements, because we'll start answering the question in a way that the customer's not expecting. So that training data piece is there's guardrails that do run either side of it, and it's really important that we understand those. And going back to our compliance teams as well as our business teams to understand what we're expecting to be questioned on, and then B, where those the answers to those questions lie. So that's our true training data. If it becomes inconsistent, then we have an issue. And we have an issue in that training data, and that's something that we need to go back to. And it's something that we should actually revisit on multiple times. So over the course of the life cycle of that AI model, we should actually look to go back and test it on a regular basis. And that's set out by the frameworks and the regulations. So something which is customer focused and critical, we should do a lot more testing, retraining, and making sure we validate our model and validate our answers. Whereas something which is potentially internal, doesn't have a customer impact, and is just between a small group, maybe you'd look to do that every 6 months or every 12 months to make sure it's good. We also need to be aware that AI has an ability to do hallucinations. So hallucinations is when the AI model, as it goes through its probability calculations, adds 1 and 1 together and comes up with 3 rather than 2. And it will start trying to give an answer based on its assumptions. Now, that may well be because the questions that it's been asked aren't defined enough for it to actually narrow down the response that it should be giving. Or it could be part of the fact that we've gone outside of our training data guardrails and we've included more data. The AI response is based on probability. So it's looking for those keywords. And if it links keywords from either side of a guardrail, it will start to actually give answers or hallucinations that it believes are correct, but aren't what we actually originally tried to train it to do. So what happens if our model doesn't perform in reality than we did when we were trying to train it? So what we're trying to say there is we thought we answered all those questions. And we can go back to those guardrails. So our model is actually giving those different answers. Where's that come from? We can go back to those guardrails. We can actually see and make sure and reestablish those guardrails and make sure our training data is within those guardrails. So what we're expecting to be asked and where we're expecting to get the answer from. If we find we've got data outside of them, then we can remove that data from the training set and retrain the application. It may well be the fact that actually that was too wide when we set out. So there is there's a conscious thing that we try to make AI as smart as possible, and sometimes it's too much information. So again, narrowing those guardrails, removing the data that's outside of them, and retraining the model to be more specific may well answer those questions. So we start getting back to the questions we put in as training questions. We start seeing the answers come out again, and that's what we're expecting to have for our clients and customers. The impacts on this are obviously potentially customers, when they talk to or they interact with the AI application, don't get the answer they want, and then they start waiting on the phone trying to get through to the call center. As an example, wait times increase, the call center becomes flooded, and we start losing momentum. So all those gains we originally went out to try and find, by having an AI application that can answer the quick, simple questions of, maybe it's my tracking number for a package is XYZ, when's this going to be delivered? The customer now gets a hallucination answer in 3 months' time, which isn't good enough, and they stay on the phone. And they want to talk to a client or talk to customer services directly. And that should have been something we were able to deal with really quickly and simply. So we start to see a negative return on having the AI model there, increased wait times, increased calls. And unfortunately, this is when the complaint part starts to become an issue, because the complaints increase as well. And not for complaints that we can use to identify the issues within our model, but these are complaints now about our business. So we need to jump onto those as quickly as possible and see them. Now, customer complaints then rise. Expectations were for them not to. They were expected to go down the other way. So again, part of our original process and requirements for bringing in the model, we were receiving complaints about wait times. So how long customers were actually on the phone. We bring the model in, it's successful for a short period of time, and then it goes into reverse. The issues here are basically trust, and this starts to see across, unfortunately, the business as well as the AI model. So internally, our employees start to distrust the model, and maybe subconsciously they start negatively thinking about it and negatively talking about it. But we also start to lose trust from our customers coming into our business. And that's obviously a big no-no, and that's what we were trying to get away from in the first place. So I hope I've covered that, Paul.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. A reminder, folks, it's not too late to get your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to have time at the end for some questions, so we'd love to hear from you. But moving on, Ben, as organizations move forward with AI, it's obviously really important that there's buy-in from wider teams, there's transparency, that there's ongoing monitoring. Can you talk about how businesses can keep on track with these points? So how do they ensure there are sufficient levels of AI literacy, knowledge? How do they make sure the right measures are in place?
So we'll take the first point. I think it's not a mitigation so much as it's an understanding right at the very beginning of our process. And this is where we need to make sure we have those teams clearly defined. And those teams need to be able to work in unison with each other, but also have the ability to question each other. So a clear business purpose. Why did we actually build the model? Why did we actually want a model in the first place? Has that purpose changed? So if it has, we need to think about that early. So it may well have been just to be a frontline tool for our call centers and our call staff guys to use, or even our clients to use and customers to use. But actually, have we now tried to change that purpose? And we need to be really upfront with ourselves and talk about it. And the teams need to be able to challenge each other. So we often see that there's hierarchies in businesses, and somebody's made a decision. But when you're talking about AI, because of the type of application it is, those hierarchy lines need to be very much dotted lines, and people need to be able to put their hand up and say, have we actually changed the purpose? And if we have changed the purpose even slightly, we need to go back through that process and understand whether or not our requirements have changed. And if the requirements have changed, then the training data changes. So we need to be able to withstand that as a business. So we need to expect that that's going to happen. We need to allow people to raise their hands and challenge, and we need to make sure it's an open forum. So it's a fair question. Are we changing the original purpose? And it's also a question that really IT or technical teams and business teams should probably ask themselves when they review these applications when they're in their cycle. So again, if you're a customer focused AI application, it should be regularly, especially if it's in a high risk area. If it's an internal one and it's just for a team to help them complete their daily tasks, then maybe it doesn't need to be quite as repetitive. But some of them are once every 3 months. Some applications will be once every 12 months. But as part of that, there is a question just to say, have our initial requirements changed? And people should be able to put their hands up. The second part, or the second question on this list or point, is the removal of bias. So the removal of bias is an interesting subject. Within Agile, we have a very diverse team, and we ask people to get together when we talk about training data. Bias is a very personal thing. So it's all about perception. And 99% of people will all think the same way. And therefore, if I think something has a bias or a slant against it, and I ring fence that data inside the training data and say, this is a piece of bias that we need to remove, most people will probably agree. Now, that's great, because any bias that we can identify, we potentially need to remove, or at the very least document and realize that we have that inside our training data and understand what that means in the wider piece. So it's okay to have bias in training data, but we need to understand it, and we need to understand what the impact on responses will be to our clients. Now, where bias gets very technical, and as an example, Paul, I think we talked about this in the wider Agile piece. We took a set of training data and we actually interrogated it with a very, very diverse team of people and identified 458 biases. Now, if we removed all 458, we'd have had no training data left. But we did need to understand them and document them. And they are a personal thing. And this is why a diverse team is really, really important. So just because I don't think something is incorrect or not something that I should say, doesn't mean to say that, as an example, Paul, you may see it differently, and you might feel that it is something which is incorrect, and that's a bias. The question is, how strong is that bias, and what does it actually mean? And that would lead you to whether or not we should remove it, or whether we can accept it, document it, and be ready for anybody to raise it. And again, that's something that comes across in complaints, especially from clients. So I asked this question, and this is the answer I got. Not very happy with the answer. And it may take somebody to actually phone that customer to find out why, but to identify it, take it forwards. And we come into this next piece, so governance and oversight. So I've talked about this a little bit already, about the technical monitoring, the oversight and the accountability. So accountability, let's just do that one. Everybody is accountable. Everybody in that process, from whoever, if it was somebody in our C-suite that decided we had a business requirement for an AI application, all the way down to the data engineer that pulled together the training data for everybody. Everybody in that process has to take accountability for it. And if we have call centers, to an extent, those teams are also accountable for that AI. Excuse me. So if something doesn't seem right, people need to put their hands up. And it is better that somebody internally puts their hand up before we do receive a customer complaint. Excuse me. So everyone becomes accountable. The technical monitoring and the oversight is a cross between our technical teams. So we need to make sure that the application is up and running. And the oversight is where we actually see that regular testing and retraining, review of our complaints. Is there any consistent complaint that's coming through that we can actually narrow down on and actually go and take that to our technical teams and talk to them about what's in the data set behind the scenes? And that leads us nicely onto that explainability, the redress, which we'll get from complaints. So how do we actually show to a customer that we have redressed the issue? And that comes down to probably the most key piece, again, in the whole AI journey, which is transparency. So we are going to use customer data more often than not for our training data, because they are the people that will ask us the questions. The questions that we sit there and think about are questions we're expecting, but what we need to know is questions that our customers want to ask us. And so that's an important part. And we need to be transparent about that, and transparent about the answers that they would have received if they were talking to a person, an individual. And that's what we're trying to push into our AI model. So if it goes wrong, we need to be able to explain that. So we need transparency. So where did that answer come from? Why did that answer come out the way that it did? And how can we show that to our customers? And that reinforces trust, and it reinforces trust back into AI and our AI models. An easy one to talk about for people that know me would find this quite funny, but I received Bambi recently on a streaming service list as something that I potentially would like to watch. It's the furthest thing from the truth. As it comes through on a streaming service, I see it as being a little bit comical, and I don't take anything from it. However, if it was in a more critical environment and a customer received a notification to say, we think that you're XYZ, it becomes a more serious matter, and it is something that a customer is going to want to see about. Now, I could go back to my streaming service and say, please show me why you think that I'd like to watch Bambi. And in an ideal world, their transparency would say, because you watch this, this, and this, and these actors are in this film, and they do the voiceovers or something along those lines. So there should be a transparent, or at least a pathway that we can see as to why that answer was given. And that's an important piece, and it always needs to be there. If you get transparency right, the rest of the pillars, in all honesty, should fall into place. And then the final piece, so the ongoing monitoring. So yes, this falls back into that oversight piece and the technical monitoring as well from a governance world, and again shows how closely these teams need to work together. We do need to test our models. We do need to go through the process. And again, depending upon the criticality of the model, and I think my example there is probably pretty good. So a streaming service is not the most critical thing in the world, and I might have a different view on that. If it was my kids, we're going to go and watch something on there, and that's where I guess that bias comes in. It's on my personal list. It's not going to be seen by anybody else. So the bias for me is very small. However, if it was a different film and it appeared on a child's list, then actually the bias against that would be pretty high. So again, diversity in the bias piece. But we do need to make sure that we test these models. So if it was a banking app, that would be really critical. And so a banking app should be tested once every 3 months at a minimum. We should be going through it. We should be, again, looking at all of our complaints, and if there are any that are received against the AI application, we should be reposting those questions back into our application. And through transparency, we should be able to understand why our customer got the answer they did. And if we didn't want them to receive that answer, then we need to do something with either the training data by adding or taking away data and retraining the model, or adding in new rules. So it may be a case of add a new rule into the background application that actually says, if the answer given is of a low score, then transfer that customer directly to somebody in the call center, apologize that unable to give the response, and that will actually resolve the issue for us. I hope that's enough mitigations and enough of me rambling on there, Paul. So
No, it's fantastic stuff. Thanks very much, Ben. So we've got time for some Q&A now. So thanks everyone who submitted a question. One that came in from Paul, Ben, which is, where is a good place for me to learn how to build my first AI model?
Good question. There's lots of ways to go around building your first model. But first of all, I think the first thing to do is to work out what it is you want to build. So start yourself off on the right path. And then once you've got that, you can go and get your model. You can go and get your training data. There's lots of open source and ways of doing that. So cloud providers, quite a few of them will have learning sites that you can go and use. I guess if you're going to go and build your first model, the ideal piece is pick a subject that you know, identify training data that you can relate to in a key way. So you need to be able to, build that question list up and your expected answer list, and then train your model on that data and continuously ask those questions. So whatever that question may be, I'm trying to think of something in my head, but whatever your question may be, but the answer that you're receiving back is what you need. You need to ratify, and through transparency and explainability, be able again to say, yes, that's the correct answer. And if it's not, then there's something inside your data that's either incorrect or your application needs further training. And it may just be that you need to ask it more questions.
You mentioned explainability there, and we actually have a question about that from Stuart. So how do I show explainability?
It's a good question. So explainability is around the data that you hold in your indexing. So the model, what the model's actually been trained on would be the first place to go. So take that question, take the answer, and you can go through and re-ask the application the same question, and you can switch on the probability score. So from the more technical people on the call, your data scientists will be able to actually review the scores that come back and the thought process that the application will go through. So AI, we have to remember, is based on a probability score. So it will take a number of key parts of the question that you ask it, and it will compare that to a number of its indexes and items that it's stored within its data set. And it will go through and give a score against those. And that's where that explainability profile comes from. The higher the score, the more accurate the response, and therefore the decision tree, because that's in effect what especially for LLMs, they still use. You'll be able to see that probability score and therefore understand why it went down the paths it went down to get to the answer it did. That's how you identify as well that your training data maybe is incomplete. So if it's taken a right turn and you expected it to take the left branch, from a human point of view, then there's an issue inside that index. And that may be the fact that it's overinflated. It may be the fact that the training data was missing from your initial data set to actually take it down the left-hand pathway. But that's how you do that. And the honest answer is that it's the data scientists who can extract that. And they should be able to give you a humanized view over the top of it to be able to explain that back to a customer or a client.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. We've got a question from Jarnik. How can I tell if there is bias?
Bias is an extremely personal point. So if you're working on your own, it's very hard to tell if there's bias. So data scientists, when they build training data sets, are able to test that data set to see if there are peaks and troughs, if there's holes and gaps, and all the kind of the jazzy stuff they do. And they produce some pretty cool graphs that look very much like radiograms. And the ideal for them is a complete picture. So if they're looking at something as a bar graph, as an example of a data set, they want to see complete lines from top to bottom, because that tells them that they have everything they need. If they see holes again, they're going into that piece where they need to identify that. They need to understand how much of an impact that's physically going to have on the data set, because that's going to be a bias against the data set. Once we say we have all of that, then the next piece to look at is the data that we've actually got. So I go back to those guardrails around our training data sets. Have I actually brought in too much data? And if you've brought in too much data, your AI model may start to say, if we use sex as an example, I've got more male answers than I have female answers, and therefore that's a better response. So everything I'm going to respond to is going to be from that side of my training data set. But if you don't need that inside your training data, then you don't bring it in, and your AI model has no idea about it, and therefore it will give a more precise and open view of your data set. So those are the easy ones to explain with bias, and you can see that within the data. The harder ones to explain with bias are individuals' perceptions, and that's where we do need diverse teams, especially from the data science world. Again, from an agile point of view, we actually get people together to talk about this quite openly and quite honestly, because what I may not have an issue with, somebody else may, and that is a bias in its own right. And you've only got to, your response has only got to be based on my bias or my understanding of bias and my understanding of the data, and it may not be reflective of yours, Paul, and you might therefore take an issue to it, and that's where bias then becomes a complaint. So the ideal is a complete and full data set. Our guardrails for that data set very tightly set, and we only use the data that we need, and we remove as many of the obvious biases as we possibly can, so that the playing field's quite open.
Right. Thanks very much, Ben. That sounds like a good place to end for today. So, Ben, a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise. Of course, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thanks very much. If today's discussion resonated with you and you're looking to assess your AI maturity, then please reach out to us for an AI maturity assessment. If you've further questions or you would like to explore specific AI challenges in your business, then please get in touch and let's continue the conversation. Don't forget, the recording of this webinar will be available, so you can revisit it and share it with colleagues. And finally, stay tuned for the next webinar, which is coming up on the 22nd of July. I'm going to keep the conversation going around AI and its place in your organization. So thanks again, and see you next time.